Good afternoon guys, how are you all doing? Welcome back to my channel. It is finally September, finally the start of the history videos back. Now, first thing, I've brought myself a light. So if you're thinking she's looking very bright, that is because I've got this big rectangular light clipped onto the top of my phone and it's beaming light at me. The only problem is it also creates a lot of heat. So I feel like I've got a radiator on me, which in the middle of winter will probably be very nice. Currently, we're having a heat wave here. It's super hot. So having a light on me, if I'm looking a little bit shiny, it's a little bit too warm to have heat hitting me in the face. And I actually recorded this video last night when it was even hotter. It's been about 32 degrees. And honestly, you could see beads of sweat on my face. It was that warm. Anyway, that's enough waffle for me. Let's get into this week's video. And it is on horse-drawn ambulances. And I'll be honest, never crossed my mind. Like, we've done quite a fair few Victorian horse job roles, but the ambulance ones, never considered it in the slightest. I'd say it's most similar probably to like the fire engine horses. Definitely didn't have to go as fast, but the kind of setup of it was very similar. So we don't really see an actual established ambulance service till around the late 1880s in this country. Before that, of course, we had horse and carts that would pick up ill people or casualties and get them to hospital. But it wasn't like a decked out ambulance, it was just a horse and cart. Also, if you were poorly or you'd had an accident, you might get carried to hospital on a sort of hammock or a stretcher. You might have been wheeled in by a police officer or a fireman on a litter. I hopefully put a picture on the screen of what a litter is. Doesn't look like much fun sat on one of them. You might have actually paid for your own taxi to the hospital. And we can actually trace right back to like the Anglo-Saxons that, you know, if you had an accident and you needed to see a doctor, you would have probably been put on a hammock and carried in, or you would have been put on the back of a horse and cart. But like I say, they weren't classed as an ambulance and it wasn't an actual service. And even in like the 1700s, some hospitals had a sort of carriage that picked up patients. But again, it wasn't classed as an ambulance. It wasn't decked out like an ambulance. It was just a sort of horse and cart. But it wasn't until the Metropolitan Asylums Board kind of started the whole ambulance service. So in the late 1800s, in London, there was a real epidemic for infectious diseases. So things like smallpox and cholera and whooping cough and typhus, and I knew I'd forget one of them. What is it? Scarlet fever. Sorry, I knew I was going to have to check. And these diseases were getting out of control. And the problem was, if you had one of these diseases and you were trying to get yourself to one of the kind of infectious disease hospitals, or the fever hospitals as they were called, you might well get your own taxi there. So you would get into the taxi, you would sit on probably a lovely soft plush seat, and you would spread that disease around. You'd spread it probably to the driver, you'd spread it sort of into the fabric of the seat. No doubt that taxi driver might well stop at a pub on the way to dropping you off at the hospital. So in that case, the driver would get out, they'd go in, and then they'd spread the disease around. And so it was just so easily spread. You may well have kind of collapsed in the street and a policeman or a fireman or someone would have picked you up, put you on a litter and wheeled you to the hospital. And while they're wheeling you along, you're spreading the disease even more while you're coughing or something. And so, yeah, it was very easily spread. So the Metropolitan Asylums Board came up with the idea of these kind of hospital carriages, which meant that they could collect patients and they could kind of keep them more secure, hopefully lessen the risk of infecting people and get them to the hospital that much quicker. So they created this sort of carriage fund, and they first raised money for 6 carriages, and they did that in 1 year, which is pretty impressive. And from what I gather, they weren't anything special. They were a bit like a kind of, now I hope I'm saying this right, like a broom carriage. I'll write it on the screen how it looks, but I've checked online and you don't say it how it looks. It just sounds like broom. That's just how it sounds. So I apologise if I'm saying that incorrectly. But it was just like a basic one of them. And what you do is you just have a little door on the back and you'd have a sort of couch on the inside and you would just push the patient onto the couch. And you can imagine what a big difference this made from somebody having to be pushed to a hospital on a litter, which would have been a horrific journey on there. And the amount of time it would have taken, because obviously someone's physically got to push you there, compared to being in the back of a horse-drawn ambulance, you're going to get there so much quicker. So if you're on death's door, you're definitely going to want the horse-drawn ambulance. But supposedly, I did read that people would shout like smallpox coming through or something like that when these ambulances went past, which I just think if you were sat in the back or laying down in the back hearing people shout, it must have been just awful. And the journey in the back of the horse-drawn ambulances weren't much better, to be honest. They were incredibly bumpy, and if you were feeling really unwell, it wouldn't have been a pleasant journey in the slightest. Now, if we look at the horses that would have done this job, I couldn't actually find much research on them at all. They were probably like any other typical Victorian London working horse. I think as job roles go, it was one of the easier ones because the ambulances were not a very heavy carriage at all, often drawn by just one horse, but sometimes two. They only tended to carry one patient at the beginning. It got more as time went on, but even then, there wouldn't have been huge amounts of weight. They didn't go particularly fast, so they might have picked up a bit of pace getting to the patient, but on the way to the hospital, they went very slowly because of just how bumpy it was for the patient in the back. Now, the Metropolitan Asylum Board, once they had these ambulance carriages, then kind of had them at different hospitals around London. And actually some of them were quite separate. So some carriages were just for smallpox, some were just for other fevers. And inside they were kind of made of like a vulcanized rubber. So they were really easy to clean out. So no cloth, no leather, no sort of fabric, anything that could kind of harbour the disease. So they were, you know, basic, but had been thought about in their kind of design. And we also then start to see other hospitals around the country have ambulances, and the first hospital outside of the Metropolitan Asylum Board was Liverpool Northern Hospital, which in 1883 was the first town to get a horse-drawn ambulance service. Now, the horses that pulled the horse-drawn ambulances would have been hired, and they would have probably come from one of the big London stables. And we actually did a video on this earlier this year, on Thomas Tilling, who owned one of the biggest stables, where he actually had several stables around London, and he hired horses out for all manner of jobs. Now, the Metropolitan Asylum Board ended up creating 6 ambulance stations. Now, these were all sort of off of their kind of like fever hospitals, and they would set up these stable yards that had quite a few stables, but they were quite big yards because they also had to have room for nurses, for assistants. So what they tended to have was the kind of main chief of the stable yard. His wife would be the housekeeper, and then they would have several drivers for the ambulances. They would have several grooms. Like I say, they would have nurses, and they would have kind of rooms where people could sleep. There'd be like a laundry room. There would also be like an equipment room, harness room, blacksmith area. So pretty big spaces. And these 6 ambulance stations meant that pretty much all of London was covered in a 3-mile radius from an ambulance station and hospital. So you can see the ambulance service really grew very quickly, from the Metropolitan Asylum Board kind of coming up with the idea and raising funds for 6 ambulances. Suddenly they've got 6 stations after just a few years, with so many carriages at each station, quite a few horses. So this grew really quickly. Until 1902, the ambulance fleet was just horse-drawn. The first petrol-driven ambulance arrived in 1904, and by 1912, on September the 14th, the last horse-drawn ambulance was seen on the streets of London. So actually this was a relatively short period from 1879 to 1912. Now, obviously, war used field ambulances, which were horse-drawn, and especially in World War One. And these horses had a very different life to the horses in London that pulled the horse-drawn ambulances. I've already mentioned, their life was, not so difficult compared to the horses in war. Their life was incredibly difficult, but the job role that they played pulling those ambulances was vital. And it is really hard to comprehend, like when you see the photos of the conditions those horses were in, it's like you just can't believe it ever happened. I think I read somewhere that something like 6 to 8 million horses served in World War One, and obviously it wasn't just horses, it was donkeys and mules as well, which is just a colossal amount. So we see field ambulances play a big part in World War One in collecting the injured soldiers. Now, obviously, I've just mentioned that there were petrol ambulances around by World War One, but obviously they couldn't get across difficult terrain. And in some parts of World War One, the mud was just unbelievably deep. The roads had been sort of blown up. It just like you couldn't have got a petrol ambulance across it. But most of the time you could still get a horse-drawn field ambulance across it. So these horses, sometimes in the dead of night, would go out towards the front line to collect injured soldiers. And they would often then take them to dressing stations or casual clearing stations. And I mean, they saved many soldiers' lives being able to pick them up and take them to the right places. But it was incredibly dangerous for them. It must have been utterly terrifying. Like, we can't imagine what it must have been like for them, what they would have seen, what they would have had to have dealt with. They had extreme fatigue. They picked up all sorts of nasty diseases. They picked up injuries just from the workload and having to go through such difficult terrain in the deep mud. They also picked up a lot of wounds because there was so much barbed wire around. They got caught up in it, they got nasty cuts from it, and they didn't heal very well out there. They didn't have the time to heal, they didn't have the right kind of medical stuff to help get these wounds to heal. And so often horses were destroyed because cuts just never healed. They were too lame, too sore, they couldn't be fixed. So it was a horrifically hard job for these horses to do, and so many of them lost their lives doing that job. It wasn't the most comfortable for the soldiers, for those injured soldiers being picked up and put in the back of the field ambulance. It wasn't luxurious in the slightest. They tried to fit in as many soldiers as possible. It would have been incredibly bumpy. It would have been a slow journey. And I did read a passage somewhere where they kind of described it as torture. Like if you've got a severe injury and then you're in the back of that ambulance bouncing up and down and being thrown about, can you imagine the pain they must have been in? We also see in World War One the Red Cross and the St John's coming together and them having many horse-drawn ambulances out there. And a lot of the images I've shown you probably of the Red Cross. And like I say, doing incredible work, rescuing these soldiers. The horse is just the most incredible animal, and we owe them so much for our history and the things that they went through to save us, to help us survive. Horsepower kept the country moving. Horsepower helped win the war. They are phenomenal animals, aren't they? They really are. I sometimes look at my horses and I think, would they have coped going to war? Because they would have been taken. I think my older horse would have. He's made of strong stuff. I think he would have definitely probably been all right. But my mare, I think she'd probably been shot, to be honest. I don't think she'd have survived for 1 second. I'm very pleased that they don't have to go through anything like that. They don't realise how lucky they are, do they? But I hope you enjoyed that first video back. I wish I had more information, but it was actually really quite a tricky subject to find much research on. So yeah, not the easiest one to start on, but hopefully very interesting all the same. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you again next week.